The prince who turned nightmares into a weapon. The real story of Vlad the Impaler. It was the summer of 1462. The sun was just brutal, beating down on the longest line of soldiers Europe had seen in a lifetime. This was the Ottoman army, the guys who had just taken Constantinople and were knocking over empires on 3 different continents. They marched into this little patch of land called Wallachia like they owned the place, because, well, they usually did. Their leader, Sultan Mehmed II, was barely 30 years old and already known as the Conqueror, riding at the head of over 90,000 men. Behind him, for miles, were the best soldiers, the best cavalry, the best engineers on the planet, carrying the newest guns and wearing the best armor, with enough supplies to last for months. This wasn't an army coming for a fight. This was an army coming to stay. They figured it'd be an easy win, a quick little campaign, a few scuffles before the local prince just rolled over. What they found instead was something that would crawl into their darkest dreams for generations and completely rewrite the rules of war. The first thing that hit them was the smell. It rode in on the summer breeze and just punched them in the face. It was death, it was rot, and it was something else. Something so awful it made guys who had seen the absolute worst of war gag and cover their mouths. We're talking about veterans who had stormed the walls of Constantinople, who had waded through rivers of blood, and they were literally throwing up on the side of the road. As Sultan Mehmed's army came over the hill near the capital Targovist, they just stopped. The guys at the front were frozen solid, like they couldn't or wouldn't take another step. At first it looked like a forest stretching out before them. But as their eyes adjusted, as their brains tried to make sense of the impossible, a horrifying truth snapped into focus. Those weren't trees. It was a forest of the dead, a work of art made from human suffering on a scale that just broke your mind. 20,000 bodies, each one stuck on a wooden stake, arranged in perfect, neat rows that went on as far as you could see, laid out with the cold precision of a parade ground. The stakes were all different heights, creating this sick, twisted canopy of death. Some of the bodies had been there for weeks, bloated and black under that relentless sun, their faces melted away into masks of pure decay, where birds had been feasting, adding a whole other layer of horror to the nightmare. Others were fresher, their bodies still looking like the men they used to be just days ago. And the worst part, the absolute worst part of it all, was that some of them were still moving, still breathing, still screaming, their voices weaving together into this symphony of agony you could hear for miles around. The dying were crying out in Turkish, in Bulgarian, in Greek, just begging for water, for a quick end, for anything at all to stop the pain. The Sultan, the man who had brought down the Byzantine Empire, took one long look at that scene and told his entire army to turn back. In that one moment, a single prince ruling a chunk of land smaller than West Virginia had just defeated the most powerful empire on the planet without even firing a single shot. His name was Vlad Dracula, and his story, man, it tells you something truly terrifying about what we're all capable of. See, Vlad wasn't born a monster. He was made into one. Back in 1442, when Vlad was just a kid, only 11 years old, his own father cut a deal with the devil Sultan Murad II. Vlad's dad, Vlad Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia, got to keep his throne. The price he had to hand over his 2 youngest sons as hostages. So little Vlad and his brother Radu were ripped away from their home and sent straight into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Now they weren't tossed into some dark dungeon or chained to a wall. That would have been too easy, too sloppy. The Ottomans were way smarter than that. No, Vlad and Radu were given the finest clothes, silk and brocade, taught by the best scholars, and trained in combat by legendary warriors. They lived in palaces, surrounded by a kind of luxury they could only dream of back home. They learned Turkish so well, they sounded like natives. They studied Arabic poetry. They debated philosophy. They even memorized parts of the Quran. They learned military strategy from the very men who had conquered half the world. They learned how to play the game of court politics from absolute masters of manipulation, and they got a front row seat to see how a real empire worked. From the outside, It looked like a sweet deal, like they were being honored, like it was a gift. Foreign princes, who got an education at the Sultan's court, usually went home as loyal puppets, though grateful for the chance, totally turned into servants of the Ottoman machine. But for Vlad, this was something way, way darker. This was psychological warfare turned into a masterpiece, and he was the canvas. Just think about it for a second. Imagine you're 11 years old, torn away from everything you know and handed over to your people's greatest enemy. You're surrounded by all this insane wealth that your captors can offer, all while knowing your own dad sold you out just to hold on to his power. You watch your little brother just fit right in, even thrive, while you refuse to break refuse, to bend the knee. You know your life is hanging by a thread, that if your dad steps out of line, you're the one who's going to pay for it. You have to understand you're not a guest, you're not a student. You're insurance. A living contract written in your own flesh and blood. While his younger brother Radu got used to it, learning to play the game, and even becoming best friends with Prince Mehmed, the same guy who would one day become the Sultan, Vlad just wouldn't break. But he did something way more dangerous. He watched. He learned. He studied how the Ottomans used fear, not as a random act of rage, but as a calculated tool to run their empire. He saw public executions that weren't just about punishing one person, but about traumatizing a whole city into obedience, about making an example so terrifying that people would just give up rather than face that kind of wrath. He saw that terror, when you use it with surgical precision, could be a weapon more powerful than any army. According to Ottoman records, Vlad was punished a lot for his defiance. We don't know exactly what they did to him, but something inside that young prince snapped during those 6 years. Or maybe it didn't snap. Maybe it was forged into something harder, colder, and a hell of a lot more dangerous than his captors ever could have imagined. Every time they heard him, he studied the technique. Every execution he was forced to watch, he memorized. He was building an arsenal in his mind, piece by bloody piece, banking all this knowledge that he would one day use to turn the Empire's own weapons back on them. And the whole time one single obsession started to grow in his mind: control. Absolute, total control. Because as a hostage he had none. In 1448, after 6 years as a prisoner in everything but name, a 17-year-old Vlad finally went home to Wallachia. 2 months later, his father was assassinated by rival nobles. His older brother Mircea was captured and buried alive. Suddenly, Vlad was all alone, surrounded by enemies with no one to back him up. The nobles running Wallachia, the boyars, were just a bunch of snakes, playing both sides, kissing up to the Ottomans one day, and the Hungarians the next, depending on who was winning. Betrayal wasn't just a thing that happened. It was the entire system. Most people in Vlad's shoes would have run, would have hidden, would have begged someone, anyone, for protection. Vlad did the exact opposite. With a little help from the Ottomans, he grabbed the throne for a hot minute, only to get kicked out a few months later. He then spent the next 8 years in exile, just planning, waiting, and watching. And when he finally took back power for good, in 1456, he had a plan that would make sure history never ever forgot his name. Vlad got something his enemies didn't, something the Ottomans themselves had taught him during those 6 long years. Fear is a type of currency, maybe the most valuable kind there is in politics, and he was about to become the richest man in all of Europe. But first things first, he had to settle a score with the boyars, the noble families who had killed his father and brother, who had betrayed his family and sold out their own country, piece by piece, to whoever paid the most. On Easter Sunday, 1459, a day that's supposed to be about resurrection and new beginnings, Vlad invited all the top noble families to a huge feast at his palace in Targovist. It was an invitation you just couldn't turn down. Saying no would be a massive insult to the new prince, a clear sign you were against him. So they all came, hundreds of them, decked out in their best clothes, dripping with jewels, showing off all the money they'd made from decades of backstabbing and scheming. They brought their wives, their kids, their whole entourage. The feast was incredible. The tables were literally groaning under the weight of all the food, roasted meats, fresh bread, fancy imported wines. There was music playing. Servants were hustling everywhere. The boyars started to relax, patting themselves on the back for being so clever, already plotting how they were going to control this new young prince, just like they controlled his dad. After the meal, when everyone was chilling out with full bellies, and their minds were a little fuzzy from the wine, as the afternoon sun started casting these long, creepy shadows through the palace windows, Vlad gave a signal. Suddenly, guards appeared in every doorway surrounding the hall. These were heavily armed guys, loyal only to Vlad, men with zero connection to the noble families, men who would follow any order without blinking. The laughter just died. The music screeched to a halt, and in that dead silence Vlad stood up. The older nobles, the ones who were actually there when his father was murdered, the ones who held the knife or gave the order or just stood by and watched it happen, were called out one by one. They were dragged outside, still wearing all their fancy Easter clothes, and impaled right there in front of the palace for the whole city to see. Their screams echoed through the streets as the stakes were driven up through their bodies, as they were lifted into the air to die slowly, over hours, sometimes days. But the younger ones, the sons and grandsons who just reaped the rewards of the crime, who inherited all that wealth and power built on betrayal, they got a different kind of punishment. Vlad made them march unstill in their fine silks and velvets on a 50-mile journey north to the ruins of Poenari Castle, an old fortress way up in the Carpathian Mountains. And there he worked them like animals, making them haul stones, mix mortar, and rebuild his fortress with their bare hands. Their expensive clothes turned to rags. Their soft hands blistered and bled. They died by the hundreds from exhaustion and the elements, but Vlad didn't give a damn. He wanted that castle rebuilt, and he wanted it built with the sweat and blood and bones of the very families who had destroyed his. By the time that castle was finished, the old noble class was basically gone, their power shattered, their money taken, their influence wiped off the map. But Vlad wasn't just getting rid of his enemies. He was sending a message that would bounce all across Europe. When a group of Italian merchants wouldn't take off their hats for him, saying it was their custom, Vlad had their hats nailed directly to their skulls. When some Saxon merchants complained about his new trade rules, he had hundreds of them impaled in the town square. When he even suspected the people of Brasov of being disloyal, he impaled so many of them that the locals started calling the area the Forest of the Impaled. And the impalement itself, it wasn't just random violence. Vlad had turned it into a cold, hard science. The stake had to be rounded on the end, not sharp. A sharp one would kill you too fast. The victim was forced down onto the stake, which was slowly pushed up through the body, carefully missing all the vital organs. Then the stake was stood up straight and planted in the ground. If they did it just right. A person could hang there for days, dying a slow, agonizing death from shock, dehydration, and infection, while birds literally pecked them apart. Vlad didn't try to hide this stuff. He arranged the bodies in geometric patterns like a garden to make sure everyone got a good look. He would supposedly hold feasts right in the middle of these forests of dying men eating his dinner while blood dripped down around him. Stories started spreading that he would dip his bread in the blood of his victims. Whether that was true or not, who knows? But Vlad sure didn't do anything to stop the rumors. In fact, he encouraged them, because every single impalement, every public execution, every carefully crafted story about how twisted he was, it all had a strategic point. Vlad was writing a message in blood that everyone from Europe to Asia could read loud and clear. This little piece of land, this tiny country stuck between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe, was being defended by a man who had absolutely no limits. If you came after him, there would be no rules of war, no exchanging prisoners, no mercy. There would only be a world of unimaginable pain. That message eventually reached Constantinople. By 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of the Byzantine Empire, decided he'd had enough. He put together an army of over 90,000 men, outnumbering Vlad's forces by at least 10 to 1. This wasn't going to be a battle. This was going to be an extermination. Vlad knew he couldn't win a straight-up fight, so he didn't fight one. As Mehmed's gigantic army pushed into Wallachia, Vlad's men just vanished into the forests and mountains. The Ottomans marched into a wasteland. Every well was poisoned. Every crop was burned to the ground. Every village was empty. All the livestock had been killed and left to rot. Every single source of food and water for hundreds of miles had been systematically wiped out. The Ottoman army kept pushing forward, but they were getting spooked. Then, the raids started. Small squads of Vlad's men would hit them in the dead of night, slipping into the massive Ottoman camp, slitting throats and melting back into the darkness before an alarm could even be raised. They poisoned what little water was left. They launched plague-infected bodies over the walls of the camp to spread disease. They even dressed up in Ottoman uniforms to cause chaos, making the invaders look at the man next to them and wonder if he was a friend or an enemy about to stick a knife in their back. Mehmed, furious, pushed his army deeper and deeper into Wallachia, determined to crush this guy once and for all. And that's when he ran into the forest of the impaled. The exact number of bodies changes, depending on who you ask, but most historians agree it was at least 20,000 corpses, maybe a lot more. And these weren't just local peasants. These were Ottoman soldiers and civilians, prisoners of war from Vlad's earlier raids, all carefully preserved for this one grotesque welcome party. The Sultan stopped his entire army. For 3 whole days they just camped there, near that forest of death, while Mehmed tried to figure out what to do. His soldiers, these were men who had conquered half the known world, were absolutely terrified. Their morale just hit rock bottom. Disease was ripping through the camp, and then Vlad delivered the final blow. On the night of June 17, 1462, Vlad launched his craziest attack. He had a move so gutsy that military historians still talk about it today. He had spent weeks gathering intel on the Ottoman camp, using spies, torturing prisoners, sending out scouts, anyone who could give him a piece of the puzzle. He knew exactly where Mehmed's tent was, where the high-ranking officers slept, where the supply wagons were, when the guards changed shifts, and where every single weak spot was. He had studied their routine so closely, he probably knew it better than the Ottomans did themselves. When the sun finally bled out on that June night, Vlad himself was at the tip of the spear, leading a strike force of 10,000 souls, each one hand-picked and ready to pay the ultimate price for their prince. This strike, forever known as the night attack of Targov East, didn't just disrupt the Ottoman camp, it turned it into chaos made flesh. Vlad's forces tore through the enemy lines like a phantom wolf through a flock of sheep, sending thousands to their final rest before a single mind could process the horror. In the suffocating darkness, with attackers dressed in familiar uniforms and barking orders in perfect Turkish, the entire camp descended into a paranoid fever dream where Ottoman soldiers cut down Ottoman soldiers, not knowing who was brother and who was a demon in disguise, while officers screamed contradictory commands, and units fired blindly into their own ranks until the entire massive army, 90,000 strong, simply dissolved into a screaming mess of confusion and pure terror. And the stories say Vlad himself led the charge, a whirlwind of death, aimed straight for Mehmed's tent, his blade painted crimson as he carved a path through the chaos. They say he got within spitting distance of the Sultan himself, a heartbeat away from changing history, before the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite guard, finally slammed the door shut, forming a desperate wall of steel around their leader. For hours, the battle was a symphony of destruction, the night lit only by the hungry flames consuming the camp, the air a choking cocktail of smoke screams and the ringing of steel on steel. When the first light of dawn broke, Vlad's men were gone, vanishing as quickly as they'd appeared. They left behind an absolute butcher's yard. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay still, taken out by their own brothers in arms as often as by a Wallachian sword. The camp was a wreck, wagons smoldering, horses running wild, officers gone. But the real damage, the deep wound, was invisible. An army that had forgotten the meaning of fear was now drowning in it. The Sultan made it out alive, but his army didn't. Not really. Something inside that unstoppable war machine just snapped. These guys had stared down death 1,000 times. They'd toppled empires. But this was different. This was a war with no playbook, waged by a man who seemed born from the shadows and chaos itself. Mehmed gave the order. Retreat. The mighty Ottoman army, an army that had never ever been sent packing by a force so small, turned tail and fled Wallachia. And just like that, Vlad had won. He'd stared down impossible odds, armed with nothing but mind games and sheer terror, and had protected his little slice of the world from the biggest empire on the planet. He should have been the poster boy for all of Christian Europe. They should have been throwing parades, sending money backing him up with everything they had. But instead, what came next showed everyone the true dark price of his victory. You see, the problem was, Vlad couldn't just turn it off. The war was over. The Ottomans were gone. The danger had passed, but the darkness he'd unleashed was still there. That weapon he had so perfectly crafted to fight a giant. This blade of pure, calculated terror had become the only tool left in his hand, and now he began to turn it on his own people, on the very souls he had fought and bled to protect. The pattern became terrifyingly simple. Someone stepped out of line, or maybe they didn't. A merchant got greedy with his prices. A beggar couldn't work. A woman was the target of a vicious rumor. A man whispered the wrong thing to the wrong person. The sick, the poor, anyone Vlad decided was corrupt or weak or disloyal or just useless, ended up meeting the same sharp wooden fate. There's this one bone-chilling story from that time. Maybe it's true. Maybe it was just a smear campaign by his enemies. But either way, it tells you everything you need to know. The story goes that Vlad called all the sick, the poor, the broken people of Wallachia to a great hall for a feast. They came in the thousands, hobbling and crawling, carried on the backs of family, all of them clinging to this one beautiful hope that their prince was finally going to take care of them. And for a moment, it seemed real. The tables were groaning with food. The wine never stopped pouring. For the first time in forever, the forgotten people of his kingdom ate until their bellies were full. And then Vlad appeared. He asked them a simple question. Do you want to be free from all your suffering, from all your worries, from your hunger? Of course they screamed yes. They cheered for him. They praised his name. And Vlad just smiled, walked out of the hall, and ordered the doors bolted shut from the outside. Then he lit the match. The story says Vlad just stood there and watched it burn, listening as the screams of hundreds of his own people clawed at the night sky as the weakest among them were erased in agony. His logic, if you can call it that, was cold and simple. They were a drain on the state. They took without giving. Wallachia, he figured, was better off without them. Now, whether that night happened exactly like the stories say, who knows, but what we know for sure is that Vlad's terror had turned on itself, eating his own kingdom from the inside out. His political life was circling the drain. His own brother Radu, bankrolled by the Ottomans, started looking like the sane choice. His Hungarian allies wanted nothing to do with him anymore. The same mind games that beat an empire were now leaving him completely alone on the world stage. By November of 1462, just a few short months after his legendary victory, Vlad was on the run, forced to flee into Hungarian territory. And in the kind of cruel joke only history can write, he was thrown in a prison cell by the very ally he was running to for help, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. The official charges are still hazy. Some say Matthias cooked up some fake letters to frame Vlad as a traitor dealing with the Ottomans. Others figure Vlad had just become such a loose cannon that even his friends wanted him locked away for good. For 12 long years, Vlad was a captive in Hungary, but this wasn't the brutal, soul-crushing imprisonment of his youth with the Ottomans. This was something else entirely, a comfortable house arrest. He settled in, even marrying a Hungarian noblewoman and starting a family, and by all accounts, He played the part of a model prisoner, a charming and compliant guest, all while secretly honing the skills from that deadly game of survival he had been forced to master as a child. In 1476, opportunity returned. Wallachia had devolved into chaos under weak rulers, and Moldavia's prince, Stephen the Great, helped orchestrate Vlad's return to the throne. Backed by Hungarian and Moldavian troops, Vlad reclaimed his throne in November 1476. He ruled for maybe 2 months. In December 1476, or January 1477, the exact date lost to history, Vlad was killed in battle against an Ottoman force near Bucharest. The circumstances remain disputed. Some sources say he was killed by his own men, either through treachery or because they mistook him for an enemy in the chaos. Others say he was overwhelmed by Ottoman soldiers. What's certain is the aftermath. His head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople as proof of death. After everything, the terror, the impalement, the psychological warfare, Vlad ended up as a trophy, displayed in the capital of the very empire he'd fought his entire life. They say his body was buried at Snagov Monastery on a little island in Romania. When archaeologists dug up the tomb back in the 1930s, they found nothing. It was empty. To this day, nobody knows where the real Vlad is buried. And maybe that's how it should be. The man who was an expert at making people vanish from the face of the earth simply vanished himself. So where does that leave us with Vlad the Impaler? It's a loaded question, man, because there's no easy answer. Back in Romania, he's often seen as a national hero. A tough SOB for sure, but an effective one who stood up to a giant and kept his country independent when all bets were off. You'll see statues of him. His face is on souvenirs. Kids learn about him in school as a defender, not a monster. For a lot of Romanians, all the dark stuff, the stakes, the terror, it was all just a necessary evil. The terrible price you have to pay to survive. But for the rest of us especially, after Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula loosely borrowed his name and bits of his history, Vlad became something else entirely. He became a vampire, a creature of the night. The historical man, the real Vlad, just got swallowed up by this gothic horror icon, and in a way that's easier for everyone, right? It lets us slap the monster label on him, call him inhuman, and file him away where he can't make us think too hard. But here's the thing. Calling him a monster, a vampire, anything but human. That's the cheap and easy way out. It's a cozy little lie we tell ourselves to avoid a much scarier truth that's staring right back at us. Everything Vlad did was human, painfully, terrifyingly human. Every single choice he made, every atrocity, every calculated act of terror, it was all done by a man using human logic inside a human system. Look, this guy wasn't born evil. He wasn't some demon child. He was made. He was shaped, piece by painful piece, by a system that drilled one lesson into his head over and over. Power comes through terror, and survival demands absolute ruthlessness. That empathy is a weakness that will get you killed. His education started when he was just 11 years old. It ended when he was 17. And in those years he learned brutal lessons about what happens to the weak, about how power really works behind the curtain, and about the cold mechanics of domination and submission. And he took those lessons and he ran with them, pushed them to their absolute logical, horrifying conclusion. He stripped away all the fancy excuses rulers usually make. That forest of the impaled, that wasn't some crazy act of a madman. That was applied psychology. It was a billboard written in human flesh, a message you could read for miles. Those night attacks weren't just blind rage. They were surgical strikes designed for maximum psychological shock. Every single gruesome act was a calculated move on a much bigger chessboard, a move designed to protect a tiny principality from enemies that had them outnumbered 10-1 or more. And this, my friends, is the part that should really mess with your head. This is what should keep you up at night. It worked. Against impossible odds, using nothing but weaponized fear and a brilliant, twisted mind, Vlad sent an empire packing. He proved that fear if you aim it just right, can do what armies can't. A force of 10,000 defeated 90,000, not with better swords or more men, but with a better understanding of the human mind and a willingness to go to places, to do things that no one else would even dare to imagine, making the cost of victory psychologically unbearable, even when it was militarily certain. To this day, military strategists at war colleges all over the world still study what Vlad did. His playbook, psychological warfare, scorched earth tactics, asymmetric warfare, it influenced military thinking for centuries, and it continues to today. When a small force is up against a giant, when a straight-up fight is suicide, they pull pages from Vlad's book, deny the enemy resources, attack their will to fight, not just their soldiers, make them bleed for every single inch of ground, make the cost of victory so high that it feels like losing. These tactics work. History proves they work. And that right there is the problem. But using that playbook comes with a hell of a price. Vlad's methods saved his country in the short run, but they absolutely destroyed him in the end. He became the very thing he hated. The boy who was tormented in Ottoman captivity grew up to become a master of torment himself. The prince who swore to protect his people ended up pointing his weapons at them. And the great defender of Wallachia, he died alone, betrayed his head ending up on a spike in the enemy's capital. So the real question isn't, was Vlad evil? I mean, come on, that's a no-brainer. The real question is what that his story tells us, about our own human nature, about how deep trauma can curdle into unimaginable cruelty, about how when you fight monsters, you risk becoming one yourself, about how the instinct to survive at any cost can burn so bright that you forget what the hell you were trying to survive for in the first place. Vlad the Impaler lived in a savage time, in a place caught between the gears of two massive empires, a world where the only way to survive was to be scarier than the guys trying to kill you, and he became the undisputed master of that dark art. But that mastery cost him everything. He saved Wallachia from being wiped off the map, sure, but what was left after the smoke cleared? A country scarred by trauma, a people who feared their own leader more than any invader, and a legacy of blood so deep it would drown out anything else he ever accomplished. 5 centuries later, we don't remember Vlad for any reforms he made, or for defending Christianity, or for the few months he might have been a decent ruler. We remember the forest of stakes, the rivers of blood, the calculated cruelty that shocked even hardened warriors. We remember him because he gave us a terrifying glimpse of what we're all capable of when fear is the only tool in the box, when empathy becomes a liability, when the only language anyone speaks anymore is violence. And maybe that's the real horror of Vlad the Impaler's story. Not that he was some kind of monster, but that he was a man. Just a man forged in the fires of his time, making what he thought were rational choices inside a savage system, just using the most effective tools he had to get the job done. He was a man who learned the terrible secret that sometimes the darkest, most twisted methods are the ones that actually work. And that knowledge ate him alive from the inside, destroying him more completely than any army ever could. His story doesn't wrap up with a neat little bow. There's no clear moral here. It just holds up a dark mirror and shows us what happens when survival is the only thing that matters, when fear is the only coin in the realm, when our own humanity becomes just another acceptable loss in the great game of power. And it leaves us with one final question to chew on. In his position with his history, his enemies, his resources, what would we have done differently? It's an uncomfortable question, but uncomfortable questions are often the ones most worth asking. The forest of the impaled is just a ghost, now turned to dust and whispers centuries ago. The screams are long gone, but the lesson that's etched into history with blood and terror. See raw power, absolute fear, survival at the cost of your soul. That stuff might get you a quick win, but it plants a time bomb that eventually takes out everything and everyone, including the guy who lit the fuse. Vlad the Impaler, he wanted his legacy to be the prince who saved his people. Instead, he became the poster child for cruelty itself. He craved control, but ended up losing control of the one thing that mattered himself. He wanted to weaponize fear against his enemies, but fear became the only language he could speak, until even his own crew was too terrified to let him breathe. And that, my friend, is the real tragedy of Vlad Dracula. It's not that he was a monster. It's that he was a man. Not that he failed, but that he was too damn good at what he did. It wasn't that his playbook didn't work. It worked perfectly right, up until the moment it spectacularly imploded. And by then the game was already over. The Prince of Wallachia was taken off the board in December 1476, his head sent to Constantinople like a trophy. But the Impaler, he lives forever, a chilling ghost in our history books, a permanent reminder of how surgically cruel we can be, and the terrible, inescapable price you pay for making a deal with fear itself.